Worksite parties. Welcome to the Worksite Parties pre-work module. In this short video, you'll be introduced to the various groups you may encounter on a worksite. We've simplified the language from the legislation in this video. So, remember to look at the resource document to see the language used in the Alberta OHS legislation. Each worksite can vary depending on the structure of the organization, the work activities, and the location of the worksite. The obligation to protect workers and others does not fall solely on the organization or employer on a worksite. There are multiple parties that must be taken into consideration when addressing workplace health and safety, and there are clearly outlined obligations for various worksite parties in Alberta OHS legislation. If you're in another jurisdiction, you will want to reference your own legislation to double-check the obligations for worksite parties. No matter the jurisdiction, when it comes to health and safety, all relevant worksite parties must be taken into consideration. Worksite parties include employers, supervisors, workers, and prime contractors, as well as additional worksite parties such as contracting employers, temporary staffing agencies, suppliers, service providers, and owners. There may be organizations and individuals on your worksite that could be considered more than one type of worksite party. If more than one set of obligations applies to a person or company, all obligations must be met. This might also mean that multiple parties have the same or similar obligations. If this results in duplication of work or puts the health and safety of anyone at risk, then all parties must coordinate to meet the obligation or must cooperate with the worksite party designated to meet that obligation. As an example, multiple parties will often coordinate the first aid stations so that the efforts are not duplicated, but workers still have the access they need to first aid supplies. In addition, all parties must cooperate with any person exercising a duty imposed by OHS legislation and comply with OHS legislation. The employer, supervisor, worker, and sometimes the prime contractor roles are present on almost every worksite. Let's learn about the employer first. Although the role of the employer may seem straightforward, the employer is represented by many different people on a worksite, and they must work together to meet their obligations. OHS legislation defines an employer as a self-employed person, a person who employs one or more workers, a person designated by an employer as the employer's representative, or a director or officer of an organization, or a person employed to oversee the occupational health and safety of the workers employed by the employer. Employers must meet their obligations as far as it is reasonably practicable for them to do so. Reasonably practicable is a term used in the legislation, and it's an important one, so you'll hear it a lot in this section. It refers to a standard set by what a dozen of your peers would do in a similar situation. Some might do more, some might do less, but on balance, what can you justify for your worksite? Employers must ensure the health, safety, and welfare of the people at and around the worksite. This includes their own workers at the worksite, other workers at the worksite, and other people who may be materially affected by identifiable and controllable hazards originating from the worksite. Identifiable and controllable is an important concept because it means the employer has an obligation to know what hazards may be present and to control them as much as reasonably practicable. Employers must also ensure that workers are aware of legislated rights and duties, aware of any health and safety issues arising from work conducted, and that workers are not subjected to or participate in workplace harassment or violence. They must also ensure that workers are supervised by a competent supervisor who is familiar with relevant OHS legislation. Employers must also ensure that the Joint Health and Safety Committee, or Health and Safety Representative if there is one, complies with all requirements imposed by the Act, regulations, or code, and that health and safety concerns raised by workers, supervisors, and the HSC and HSR are resolved in a timely manner. Employers must also ensure that workers are adequately trained so that they can do their work in a healthy and safe manner. Sometimes work must be done that could endanger a worker. When this is the case, the employer must ensure the work is done by a competent worker or under direct supervision of a worker who is competent to do the work. Remember the obligation above to ensure the health and safety of people at or near the worksite who may be materially affected by identifiable and controllable hazards. Part of ensuring health and safety includes providing information. This means that employers must have information related to worksite hazards, controls, work practices, and procedures readily available, and they must provide this information to the HSC or HSR, the workers, and the prime contractor if there is one. Employers must also ensure that the current OHS Act, regulations, and code are available to workers and the HSC or HSR in either paper or downloaded or stored electronic version. Self-employed persons are considered employers in the Alberta OHS legislation. This means that all of these obligations must be met by self-employed persons with any necessary modifications. And, of course, every employer must cooperate with any person exercising a duty imposed by the OHS Act, regulations, or code. Supervisors directly oversee frontline workers. OHS legislation considers anyone who has charge of a worksite or authority over a worker to be a supervisor. This extends far beyond frontline supervisory staff, and it's important to remember that if a worker has authority over another worker or charge of a worksite, even if they don't have the title of supervisor, they must meet the obligations for supervisors. Supervisors must, as far as it is reasonably practicable, take all precautions necessary to protect the health and safety of every worker under the supervisor's supervision, ensure that workers under the supervisor's supervision work in accordance with OHS legislation, and ensure that none of the workers under their supervision are subjected to or participate in harassment or violence at the worksite. Just like employers, supervisors have obligations related to sharing information in order to ensure health and safety. This means that supervisors must advise every worker under their supervision of all known or reasonably foreseeable hazards to health and safety in the work area, and must report to the employer any concerns about unsafe or harmful worksite acts or conditions. And, of course, they must cooperate with any person exercising a duty imposed by the OHS Act, regulations, or code. OHS legislation defines a worker as a person engaged in an occupation, including a person who performs or supplies services for no monetary compensation. In other words, volunteers are considered workers under the legislation. Students are an exception to this definition, because a student engaged in unpaid learning activities is not considered a worker. There are some exceptions to this, such as students in work experience programs in an industrial setting, or students performing work on behalf of an educational institution or instructor, and you can find guidance on these situations from the Government of Alberta's bulletin titled Are Students and Volunteers Workers? Just to add even more complexity, some people engaged in farming and ranching work are also not included in the definition of a worker. Workers also have obligations within the legislation. These include the obligations to take reasonable care to protect the health and safety of themselves and anyone in the area, cooperate with their supervisor, employer, or any other person to protect the health and safety of themselves and others in the area, use all required safety devices and wear all necessary personal protective equipment, or PPE, refrain from causing or participating in harassment or violence, and report any concerns about unsafe or harmful worksite acts or conditions to their supervisor or employer. Workers must also participate in any training provided by the employer and cooperate with any person exercising a duty imposed by the Act, regulations, and code. In addition, a worker who is not competent to perform work that may endanger themselves or others must not perform the work except under the direct supervision of a worker who is competent to perform the work. Prime contractors are defined by their obligations and are only required at specific types of work sites. Because the type of worksite is so critical to the definition, let's start there. A prime contractor must be present when there are 2 or more employers at oil and gas work sites, at construction work sites, or when an Alberta OHS director determines a prime contractor is required. A prime contractor may also be voluntarily designated when 2 or more employers are involved at the same work site, even if it's not a requirement. There's a long list of activities that define a construction work site. You can find this list in your handout, and it's worth knowing. As a general rule, if the work includes any kind of building, demolishing, or disturbing the land, it's a construction worksite. When a prime contractor is required, that role can be held by the organization in charge of the worksite or by a contracting employer who has been assigned the role. This means that employees of an organization may have taken on the role of prime contractor on some worksites and worked with an external prime contractor on others. Regardless of whether this role is held internally or externally, the same obligations must be met. Because of the many ways this role can be filled, it is critical, and in fact legislated, that the prime contractor is designated in writing by the person in control of the worksite, and that the name of the prime contractor must be posted in a conspicuous place at the worksite. If the person in control of a worksite fails to designate a prime contractor when required, then the person in control of the worksite is deemed to be the prime contractor. In short, somebody is responsible for health and safety on the worksite, and that will fall to the person in control of the worksite unless a prime contractor has been designated in writing. It's important to note that an HSC is not required at a site where a prime contractor has been designated. Think of the prime contractor as the point person for health and safety on a worksite with multiple employers who may each have their own systems and processes. Rather than having all those different systems and processes potentially conflicting with each other, the prime contractor takes on the role of establishing a single system or process for the worksite, which includes all of the employers and their workers. This means that the prime contractor has an obligation to establish a system or process that will ensure compliance with the OHS legislation across the worksite, including a system or process to ensure cooperation between the employers and workers when it comes to health and safety. They must also designate a person in writing for the purposes of ensuring cooperation between the employer and workers when it comes to health and safety. And they must implement a system to address the duties and responsibilities that would have been assigned to the Joint Health and Safety Committee or Health and Safety Representative. We'll come back to this point in a minute. The prime contractor must conduct their own activities in a way that ensures, as far as reasonably practicable, that no person is exposed to hazards arising out of or in connection with activities at the worksite. In addition, if a requirement in the OHS legislation imposes a duty on an employer regarding equipment, worksite infrastructure, or excavation, and the equipment or infrastructure is designed, constructed, erected, or installed, or the excavation is conducted by or on behalf of a prime contractor, then the prime contractor must comply with the requirements as if the requirements were directly imposed on the prime contractor. This means that when it comes to certain activities, the prime contractor takes on the obligations of an employer when the prime contractor is performing or directing those activities. Now, can you guess the final two obligations of the prime contractor? They have to do with information and cooperation, and they're very similar to the obligations we've seen for other worksite parties. Every prime contractor must ensure that the owner and any employer, supplier, or service provider on a worksite is informed of any existing or potential worksite hazards that may affect workers or other people at the worksite. And every prime contractor must cooperate with any person exercising a duty imposed by the OHS Act, regulations, or code. Now, let's come back to the duties of the Joint Health and Safety Committee or Health and Safety Representative mentioned earlier. On a site with a prime contractor, an HSC or HSR is not required, even if they would be required if there was no prime contractor. This means that the prime contractor is responsible for meeting the legislated duties of an HSC or HSR on a site where there is a prime contractor required or designated. HSCs and HSRs are a whole other, very important area of legislation that is beyond the scope of this video. What you need to know is that these health and safety roles serve an important purpose, and when a prime contractor is present, the prime contractor fulfills these obligations. This means that the prime contractor must, in addition to their other obligations, be responsible for the receipt, consideration, and disposition of concerns respecting the health and safety of workers, participation in the employer's hazard assessments, the making of recommendations to the employer respecting the health and safety of workers, and the review of the employer's worksite inspection documentation. Contracting employers, temporary staffing agencies, suppliers, service providers, and owners may also be present at your worksite. A contracting employer means a person, partnership, or group of persons who, through a contract, agreement, or ownership, directs the activities of one or more employers involved in work at a worksite. This means that on a site where an employer is under a contract to direct or perform work, they must meet these obligations. Prior to the December 1st, 2021 legislation changes, you may have heard this role described as a contractor rather than contracting employer. When a contracting employer directs the activities of an employer at a worksite, they must ensure, as far as it is reasonably practicable to do so, that the employer complies with the OHS Act, regulations, and code. They must also ensure that the owner and any employer, prime contractor, supplier, or service provider on a worksite is informed of any existing or potential worksite hazards that may affect workers or other persons at the worksite. Every contracting employer shall cooperate with a person exercising a duty imposed by this Act, the regulations, and the OHS Code. A temporary staffing agency retains workers and deploys or facilitates the placement of those workers with other employers. Temporary staffing agencies have an obligation to ensure, as far as is reasonably practicable, that workers are suitable for the tasks they will be assigned, that workers are equipped with necessary personal protective equipment or will be equipped by the other employer, and that the other employer is capable of ensuring the health and safety of the worker. And, you guessed it, every temporary staffing agency shall cooperate with any person exercising a duty imposed by this Act, the regulations, and the OHS Code. According to Alberta OHS legislation, a supplier is a person who sells, rents, leases, erects, installs, or provides any equipment, or who sells or otherwise provides any harmful substances or explosives to be used by a worker for any occupation or worksite. Every supplier shall, as far as it is reasonably practicable, ensure that any personal protective equipment or equipment that the supplier supplies is in safe operating condition and ensure that any harmful substance or explosive supplied is safe to use when used in accordance with the manufacturer's specifications. If the supplier has responsibility under an agreement to maintain equipment, then they must ensure that the equipment is maintained in a safe condition in accordance with the manufacturer's specifications, if any, and in compliance with the Act, regulations, and code. Suppliers have unique obligations when it comes to information because they provide equipment, harmful substances, and explosives, which may become with potential hazards. Because of this, they must provide a notice to anyone who has been supplied with personal protective equipment, or with harmful substances or explosives, when the supplier becomes aware or ought reasonably to be aware that the equipment does not comply with a standard prescribed under the legislation. They must also ensure that any personal protective equipment, harmful substance, or explosive is supplied with a written copy of the manufacturer's specifications and any other instructions for safe use as applicable if those specifications and instructions exist. These obligations related to information are about ensuring that anyone who may be exposed to a hazard is aware not only of the hazard but also of the available controls. And, last but never least, every supplier shall cooperate with any person exercising a duty imposed by the Act, regulations, and code. A service provider is a person who provides training, consulting, testing, program development, or other services for any occupation or worksite. As far as reasonably practicable, every service provider must ensure that any service provided to a person in order to help that person meet an obligation in the Act, regulations, or code will enable the person to comply with the Act, regulations, and code. Service providers must ensure that all services provided comply with the Act, regulations, and code, and that those services are completed by workers who are competent to provide those services. They must also ensure that, as far as it is reasonably practicable for the service provider to do so, no person at or in the vicinity of a worksite is endangered as a result of the service provider's activity, and, as always, they must cooperate with any person exercising a duty imposed by the OHS Act, regulations, and code. Owner means the person who is referred to under the Land Titles Act as the owner of the land on which work is being carried out or may be carried out, or the person who enters into an agreement with the owner to be responsible for meeting the owner's obligations under OHS legislation. It does not include a person who occupies land or premises used as a private residence unless a business, trade, or profession is carried on in that premises. The owner's obligations are related to the land, infrastructure, and any building or premises on the land. They must ensure, as far as is reasonably practicable, that the land, infrastructure, building, or premises is provided and maintained in a manner that does not endanger the health and safety of workers or any other person. Every owner must also ensure that any hazard identified by the owner is communicated to all workers, employers, contracting employers, prime contractors, suppliers, and service providers that are conducting work activities or may be reasonably anticipated to conduct work activities on their premises. And, you guessed it, every owner shall cooperate with any person exercising a duty imposed by the Act, regulations, and code. Now that you've been introduced to the various worksite parties and their obligations under Alberta OHS legislation, you're better prepared for your course. Some of this content will be reviewed in your course, and if you need a refresher, take a look at your participant guide or the resource document included with this video.